as I can remember. The funny thing is, I don't really know where the idea comes from. Nobody ever told me there were monsters, but it's as if every kid in the world came to the consensus that they're real and they lurk in their, and only their, bedrooms. It doesn't matter how much their parents insist it isn't true. When I was a kid, the idea terrified me like nothing else. It wasn't the thought that the monster would hurt me. Not really. Obviously, that's part of it. But it was always more so the watching that bothered me. The idea that something could be so still, so quiet, observing me in the privacy of my own home while I was none the wiser. Those nights in bed as a very young child, feeling as though I were being watched, were some of the longest and most dreadful nights of my life. I would wrap myself up in my blankets, head buried in a cocoon of heat and fear, feeling the sweat bead on my forehead as minutes ticked by. I would overheat so badly that very often I got nosebleeds, but I was so afraid that something might be waiting for me to emerge from the safety of my bed that I would stay put, ruining my pillows with thick blood. So, I came up with a system, a ritual, if you will. I made my dad go through it every night before I went to sleep, and he complied, most likely because he was relieved he didn't need to buy new pillowcases every other week. So he humoured me, at least as a 6-year-old. Not so much when I was 12 or 18. As I grew older and the fear refused to subside, it fell upon me to go through the process each night. The steps were particular and I followed them religiously. Close and lock the bedroom door. If the door was opened at any point during or after, the entire process would need to be repeated. Look behind the curtains. I always had these long, floor-length blackout curtains, and I was plagued by the idea of something standing behind them. Check underneath the bed. This step needed to be completed with a light, because if I wasn't 100% sure that I had, in fact, found nothing, I would need to double-check until I was certain. Look inside the closet. This step absolutely had to be last. My rationale was that nothing could sneak up on me from a quieter hiding spot. You can shuffle curtains quietly enough, or slowly emerge from underneath the bed. But the sound of a door opening is more noticeable. Only then, once my bedroom has been thoroughly secured, would my compulsions subside, and I would feel safe enough to go to sleep. It went on this way for years, being teased over it constantly by my parents, until I relented and told them I had stopped. But I hadn't. Living alone in my very own apartment should have brought freedom and joy. But instead, my fright grew until it was nearly unmanageable. I sought out therapy and found understanding from a professional who had seen cases similar to mine in the past. It was a comfort that almost matched the relief my ritual brought, the knowledge that I wasn't alone. Together, we confronted my fear. I'm not going to go into it. What happens during my therapy sessions is mine to know, and it was a very difficult process. All that's important is that we came up with a plan to rid myself of my compulsion, and it worked. Of course, I had bad days, everybody does, but I was finally able to tell my family truly and with confidence that I did not need to follow a contrived set of instructions before going to bed each night. Looking back on it now, the knowledge that I went so long without doing my nighttime lockup makes me feel ill. It was a night like any other when it happened. I had just finished up watching a movie when I noticed the time. It was midnight, and I kicked myself mentally because I had to be up early for work the next morning. I turned off all the lights in my apartment and made myself comfortable in bed. But something felt off. I wouldn't say I sleep particularly soundly each night, but I was tossing and turning far more than I usually would. I felt the uncomfortable, revealing sensation of being watched, like when I was a child and my dad had messed up the ritual somehow, like your entire being is being laid bare. But I knew that giving in to what I felt creeping up on me would only be a temporary reprieve, so I stayed in bed. I must have lied there for hours trying to greet a sleep that would never come. Every minute seemed to crawl on, no matter how much I tried to distract myself. I kept up this struggle for the better part of the night before I cracked. I was sweating profusely, which I realised was because I had practically trapped myself in my comforter. I untangled myself with that tired anger you feel from a particularly bad bout of insomnia. Grabbing my phone from its place on my bedside table, I switched on the flashlight and began through the familiar steps. Even though it had been so long, it was muscle memory to me by that point. I always locked my bedroom door, regardless of the ritual. I lived in a rather large apartment complex after all, but I went over to jiggle the handle regardless, as I already knew in my rational mind it was locked tight. I slid in my slippers over to my curtains, even though I knew there was nothing there, as I now owned a shorter set that ended just around my waist. I felt as though if I skipped a step, the entire affair would be tarnished. Feeling a wave of exhaustion sweep over me as I began to calm, I swept my flashlight's beam over to the bed, peering from my place by the window first, before getting on my hands and knees to take a look. There were boxes of junk and some wayward clothes in its dusty maw, so I looked around for a long moment. I knew that if I wasn't convinced I'd seen nothing, no creatures or beasts, that my brain would make me do it all over again. Creak! I was so startled I banged my head on my bed frame. Peering over to the other side of my bedroom, there was something very wrong. My closet door was open. I redirected my flashlight. There was a man in my closet. He was bald. Not just bald, completely hairless. No eyebrows or eyelashes, no hair on his arms, nothing. His bare skin was shiny and pulled tight around his muzzle, as if it was a size too small, and his entire body was clammy and wet, like he had been sweating in anticipation, or maybe excitement. The expression on his face was one of shock and amusement, almost delight, like he had been caught in a game of hide and seek only he privy to. And his eyes, they were a dull grey, glazed over, and I could feel he was somehow looking directly into me. I have never in my entire life felt more exposed. It didn't matter that I was fully clothed. It was as if I was naked under his gaze, not just of clothes but of skin, muscle and bone. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out, but not for me. He grabbed the door handle with his sweaty hand, and I heard a disgusting wet noise when they connected, and then he began to close the door, as if everything was normal, as if he belonged there. As he did so, he brought a single finger up to his mouth, like he was shushing me. He never said it, never even made a sound, but I knew what he was trying to tell me. Don't spoil the fun. Then the door shut. The rest of that night is a total blur. I remember frantically unlocking doors and sobbing for help, and a crowd of people in the hall. Police officers asking me questions that I didn't know how to answer. All I know with clarity is that I ended up staying at a close friend's house for what was left of the night. The following day, I went down to the police station. We went over my story again, now that I was coherent, but it still didn't provide much as to details. They informed me they had looked into the security footage from around my building. It showed the man entering the building and creeping his way into my apartment, shuffling with a noticeable glee. There wasn't footage of him leaving, but their search of the building, they told me, had come up with nothing. No man. It was as if he had vanished, or he was still in the building, hiding, because the video of him forcing his way into my home wasn't from that night. It wasn't even from that day. It was from a week before. I returned to that apartment only once, just to grab my things before moving in with my friend. I rummaged through my house as quickly as possible, trying to grab anything I'd need, wanting to be in and out. But I ended up having to replace most of my wardrobe, because when I entered that bedroom one last time and grazed my hand over the doorknob, something caught my eye. There in the door, about eye level, someone had carved a small hole. It hadn't been made by a drill, it had been worn down over time. A peephole. I still live with that friend, now my fiancé, which, if anything, is the silver lining of it all. We moved far away from that city, got ourselves a nice little house to ourselves, surrounded by plenty of neighbours. I indulge in my ritual more than I ever did as a child. It now involves the entire house, a long, elaborate system that I won't explain. My fiancé never judges, at least not to my face, because that man, monster, thing, whatever it was in my house that night. I fear that if I dare stop my ritual, if I let myself get too comfortable, if I allow myself a single night of reprieve, that one night I don't check will be the night he comes back for me, and I'll always be afraid of monsters.